Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò at New York University. My name is Eugenio Refini. I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies, and I'm really delighted to be introducing tonight's event. This is the fourth lecture in our brand new John Freccero lecture series, which we inaugurated this past academic year. This is a lecture series co-sponsored and co-organized by our Department of Italian Studies at NYU and Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò. I would like to thank, as always, Casa Italiana and Stefano Albertini, his director, for the massive help they always give us for organizing events. And we are particularly happy to be joining forces for the John Freccero lecture series. As we have mentioned throughout the year, of course, John Freccero has played a crucial role in the history of our department, most influential Dante scholar, but also the kind of person who really shaped, in a way, what the Department of Italian Studies at NYU is nowadays. We are very happy to be honoring his memory in this lecture series. We also are delighted to acknowledge the generous support which we received for this lecture series, thanks to a gift from Dr. Thomas Bellezza and Mr. John Jensen. Now, tonight, as I said, this is the fourth event in our series, and we sort of chiudiamo in bellezza, really, with a talk which brings us back to the Middle Ages after having ventured into different territories over the year, and we are really happy to host tonight Professor Gur Zak, who's going to talk about Boccaccio in particular. Let me introduce Professor Zak. We are very happy to have him with us tonight because he's one of the leading scholars of Italian medieval literature, someone who has been devoting much attention to the intersections of literature and the history of emotions in particular in recent years, and he's certainly one of the to-go persons for this particular interaction of fields. He's an associate professor of comparative literature and Roman studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he also serves as the head of the Institute of Literatures. His primary research interests lie in the interrelations between literature, ethics, and the emotions in the later Middle Ages and the Italian Renaissance, with a particular emphasis on the three crowns, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. He's the author of two very important monographs, Petrarch's Humanism and the Care of the Self, Cambridge, 2010, and Boccaccio and the Consolation of Literature with PIMS 2022. He's also very recently the editor and co-translator of the book Wandering to Other Times, Francesco Petrarch, Selected Writings, Jerusalem 2023, which is the first translation of a selection of Petrarch's Latin works into Hebrew. And I would like to stress the fact that Professor Zak is one of the scholars who really have tried to bridge the divide between the Latin Petrarch and the vernacular Petrarch, bringing these two heads in a way together. And I think his work really needs to be praised for this particular reason as well. His current research deals with the literary, philosophical, and political implications of compassion in the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance, from Dante to Tasso. He's the author of numerous essays appeared in journals such as Speculum, MLN, I Tatti Studies. He has contributed to the Cambridge Companion to Petrarch, the Cambridge Companion to Boccaccio, and the Oxford Handbook of Medieval Latin Literature. He's also interested in the theory and practice of autobiography from antiquity to the present, and contemporary theories of affects, which of course is another very important area of his work, because again, I think he's one of those precious scholars who really manages to do work across theory, as we normally think about it in contemporary terms, and pre-modern materials. And he does it always in a very interesting way, finding the right balance between philology, which is also part of tonight's talk, and interpretation. So tonight, Professor Zak is going to talk us about Boccaccio's Anger, a case in the philology and politics of emotions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Zak to the podium.
Thank you, Eugenio, for this wonderful and generous introduction. And it's lovely to be here. I'm very grateful to the Department of Italian Studies and the Casa Italiana. And it's great to see many colleagues and friends here from New York and the area. And to honor the memory of John Freccero, the great scholar John Freccero, which I did not have the privilege of knowing personally, but I must say that his scholarship has been a guiding beacon for me from the very start. Because as someone, as Eugenio said, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Petrarca and Petrarch and the Self. And as working on this topic, I inevitably found myself engaged with Freccero's lapidary essay, The Fig Tree and the Laurel, Petrarch's Poetics, which was first published in 1975. In his sharp and provocative fashion, Freccero argued that Petrarch constructed a self-enclosed universe in his poetry, in which the self is fashioned as an essentially aesthetic, even fetishistic object, encapsulated in the figure of the laurel. Like others before me, I debated in this book with this Freccero's formulation. However, I think that as Foucault famously observed in his essay, What is an author is one who facilitates the creation of a field of study and serves as its emblem. And in this light, Freccero can well be considered an author in the full sense of the word, and his impact on our field is very much alive. But in my talk today, I would like to turn to a different author, one who, in contrast to Petrarch, cannot be accused of self-enclosed narcissism. This is not the author of today. And I also turn to a different set of concerns. And I refer, of course, to Giovanni Boccaccio, and I intend to explore today the role of emotions in his capolavoro, the Decameron. Among its many other attributes, Boccaccio's Decameron may well be considered a laboratory of emotions. From the famous opening aphorism, Umana cosa è aver compassione degli afflitti, in which compassion is presented as the essence of humanity, to the concluding focus on Griselda's incredible meekness in the closing tale, the novella of the Decameron repeatedly depict human emotions in their noble as well as base attributes. The work thus offers us a particularly rich storehouse through which to probe our emotions were understood and constructed in 14th century Italy, which is of course a major concern of the burgeoning field of the history of emotions, as well as of the ways in which literature may be used as a means to shape, manipulate, or otherwise contain the emotions, a central concern of recent as well as medieval literary theory. This presentation will delve specifically into Boccaccio's engagement with the emotion of anger. Thanks primarily to the work of historian Barbara Rosenwein, medieval anger has been amply discussed by historians who emphasize the scripted and socially constructed nature of the emotion of anger, yet I think still to a lesser extent by literary critics. In Boccaccio studies, anger has been touched upon in recent fine articles by Miriam Pascal and Michael Papio, yet I believe that much remains to be explored in this regard, especially with respect to the broader ethical, political, and gendered implications of Boccaccio's representation of anger. So in my talk today, I would like to highlight Boccaccio's elaborate preoccupation with anger in the Decameron, arguing that the tales shape a novel conception of virtuous anger for the later Middle Ages, one that underscores the ethical and political necessity of anger, while asserting at the same time that such anger should lead to correction and not just mere vengeance. This conception, I will argue, is based on Boccaccio's inventive dialogues with both Aristotelian and patristic attitudes towards the emotions in general and anger in particular, bringing these traditions together within a secular and worldly context, and thus secularizing anger in a significant way. In developing this conception, as we will see, Boccaccio departed from both feudal honor codes that fueled in his view violent vendettas, and at the same time Christian and Stoic ideals that prioritize mansuetude and patience at all costs, forging instead a middle path between these traditions. In doing so, finally, Boccaccio also transformed, I think, misogynistic assumptions common in his day, both introducing and subverting traditional associations of excessive problematic anger with women. My analysis will begin with a very short history of anger in antiquity in the Middle Ages. I will concentrate on philosophical and theological sources that I think are especially crucial for Boccaccio. I will then turn to Boccaccio's Decameron, and I will analyze three tales within the work, which three of them revolve around anger. I will talk about the third story of the fourth day, the ninth story of the first day, and the sixth story of the second day. These three tales introduce three types of anger, which largely correspond to the Aristotelian tripartite scheme involving this emotion. That is, the two extremes, excessive anger on the one end and excessive timidity or mansuetude on the other, and I will speak about this more shortly, and the noble mean between them, that is, the virtuous type of anger. By shifting between these different types of anger, Boccaccio, I will suggest, employs storytelling as a tool for shaping his readers' ethical sensibilities, ideally refining their emotional disposition vis-a-vis anger. For if we follow the Aristotelian view that emotions are forms of thought that contain an inevitable element of judgment, what contemporary affect theorists will describe as cognitive, then engaging closely with literary representations of emotion may have the power to shape readers' emotional perspective, or at least this is the ideal we would like to believe in. But let's begin first with some history. Classical antiquity has imparted two central views of anger to the Middle Ages, the Stoic and the Peripatetic. In opposition to modern Freudian views that consider anger and aggression inherent to the psyche and in need of a discharge, both Aristotle and the Stoics understood anger as a desire for vengeance that emerges out of an outer offense. And this is Seneca in the era, the famous definition: anger is the desire of avenging an injury. Now, Aristotle follows the same kind of definition. However, Seneca also views such desire for vengeance as necessarily negative, a type of brevem insaniam, a brief madness. Aristotle, in contrast, was open to the possibility of virtuous anger, insisting that anger, like all other emotions, is a product of a quick process of thought that determines that a significant offense has been inflicted. Aristotle argued that the movement of anger is praiseful if applied in the right manner and at the right moment and for the right length of time. And this is a famous statement from the Nicomachean Ethics at the fourth book. It is only when not governed in this fashion by reason, which is admittedly never an easy task, right? We all know that anger becomes a perilous vice. The church fathers were deeply influenced by ancient Stoic thought and turned anger into a mortal sin. Gregory the Great, for example, invested much effort in warning against the dangers of ira and included it in the list of 7 deadly sins. And this is from the Moralia in Job. You have the Latin above. I will read the translation below. So Gregory writes, "Let us consider then how great the sin of anger is, by which, while we part with mildness, mansuetudo, the likeness of the image of the Most High is spoiled. By anger, wisdom is parted with, so that we are left wholly in ignorance what to do and in what order to do it. As it is written, anger rests in the bosom of a fool." The assumption that anger may be contained within bounds, Gregory asserted with Seneca, is a mirage, and it is therefore mansuetudo, the virtue of Christ, that all Christians, according to him, should aspire to. While condemning anger, the early Christian tradition also gave some attention to the possibility of righteous anger. Having to account for the often angry God of the Old Testament, Lactantius contended in the early 4th century that there is a good type of anger whose aim is to correct sins. And he writes, "Anger is an emotion of the mind, motus animi, arousing itself for the correction of sins." In presenting a good type of anger, Lactantius was echoing Aristotle. Yet he also made sure to differentiate between his Christian position and the classical one of Aristotle. Anger, Lactantius insisted, is not a response to injury, as Aristotle and the Stoic asserted, but a desire to correct wrongs. We rise to take vengeance, not because we have been hurt, but to preserve discipline, to correct morals, to suppress licentiousness. Haec est ira justa. This is just anger. Whereas the classical tradition focused on personal honor and the assault to self, the Christian anger of Lactantius concentrated on correcting the spiritual faults of others. Anger is essentially a form of righteousness, and this is a crucial point that I would like to repeat throughout this talk, that there is the classical type of anger and there is the Christian type of anger. And what I will argue that for Boccaccio, what's important is the way that he brings them two together. The emphasis on the possible positive dimensions of anger was further with the entry of Aristotle's work to the Latin West, as we know, in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Aristotelian approach was, of course, most fully developed by Aquinas. For Aquinas, ira is one of the 5 irascible passions, and he defines it following Aristotle again as a movement of the mind, motus animi, that emerges out of an outer offense that leads to a desire for retribution. And this is from the Summa. The movement of anger does not arise save on account of some inflicted sorrow, and unless there be desire and hope of revenge. Aquinas, let us note, adds to the definition the important connection between anger and other emotions, such as sorrow, tristitia, and hope, spes, a point that, as we will see, will be crucial to later medieval representations of anger. Now, further, like Aristotle, Aquinas distinguished between virtuous and vicious anger. Virtuous anger adheres to right reason and is a mean between excessive ira on the one hand and timidity or excessive mansuetude on the other. And when discussing the nature of righteous anger, Aquinas interestingly brings together the Aristotelian and Lactantian perspectives, as he insists that anger is righteous and just when involving not only the desire to avenge injury to self, but also, again, to correct sins of others. And this he states, again in question 158, second part of the second volume, Righteous anger is directed to debitum finem, to the due end, namely the maintaining of justice and the correction of sins. And in this respect, anger becomes for Aquinas even part of charity. The two are linked in the Summa. Now, while Aquinas concentrated on the theological and ethical dimensions of anger, it was his student, Giles of Rome, who applied it explicitly to the political realm. In his extremely influential Mirror of Princes, De Regimine Principum, completed around 1280-81, Giles turned the emotional education of the prince into a major political issue. With respect to anger, Giles deviated from traditional association of princely anger with tyranny and insisted that the prince must become angry, must feel the assault on justice as if it is an assault upon himself. Yet, of course, contain this type of anger within reasonable bounds. And let me read parts of this statement of Giles. It is inappropriate for a king to be irascible, lest he be distorted and led astray by anger. Likewise, if he were in no way irascible and were never moved to administer punishment, this would also be improper. Because if punishments were not carried out in a kingdom, people would commit injustices against one another, and the political order could not endure. With Giles, the anger of the king emerged as a precondition for justice and maintenance of the political order. A sovereign cannot remain detached. Boccaccio, as we know, and I'm now arriving to Boccaccio, was a devout reader of Aristotle and Aquinas, and likely also Giles of Rome, although unfortunately we don't have a quotation of Giles by Boccaccio, unlike Dante. Dante uses Giles directly in the Convivio, but I think it is very likely that Boccaccio read the Giles because it was so widespread in the peninsula. Now, in the period of writing the Decameron, Boccaccio was also very much occupied with Seneca's writings, including the De Ira, as we know from his Zibaldoni. His predecessor inquiries into the phenomenology and ethical and political consequences of anger have often found a way into the novelle. And I would like now to turn to analyze his literary appropriation of these sources by looking at the three novellas I mentioned, 431926. While being attuned now to his philosophical and theological sources, I will also give ample attention to his dialogue with Dante, particularly the latter's account of anger within the Purgatorio, which is, of course, never far from Boccaccio's mind. The three stories, as noted, encapsulate the three levels of anger in the scholastic scheme, and when examined together, they allow us to elucidate the contours of Boccaccio's vision of virtuous anger. So let's begin with a short look at the third story of the fourth day, which is dedicated the day to the tragedies of lovers, and thus a natural space for lingering on the destructive potential of passions. In the beginning of the tale, the narrator, Loretta, offers the following explicit definition of anger. And I will read now that the original and the translation of McWilliam is in brackets. L'ira, niuna altra cosa è che un movimento subito e inconsiderato, da sentita tristizia sospinto, il quale, ogni ragion cacciata, in ferventissimo furore accende l'anima nostra. For Loretta, then anger is an instinctive and uncontrolled affect that emerges out of an outside offense which leads to sadness that is then transformed into the desire to inflict harm. This rage is depicted as a form of madness, clouding reason completely. Now, both Michael Papio and Miriam Pascal have pointed to the scholastic roots of this definition very rightly with its association of the emotions of ira and tristizia as a clear evocation of Aquinas' account discussed above. At the same time, the way that the definition identifies anger as categorically negative, a form of madness, appears close to Seneca's binary attitude expressed in the De Ira. Following this initial condemnation of anger, Loretta gives it a clear gender dimension as she asserts that women are particularly prone to it and that in them it is especially dangerous. And this is the statement of Loretta. Con maggior danni se nelle donne veduto, perciò che più leggeramente in quelle s'accende. Given their propensity for anger, Loretta urges women to cultivate their mansuetudine and benignità, learning to suppress their anger so as to prevent wider calamity. According to Gregory, as we have seen, mansuetudo is the virtue of Christ, and it is this mansuetudo that women are called upon by Loretta to cultivate. Now, Loretta's tale itself indeed lives up to its opening caveat, as it illustrates how the protagonist, Ninetta, becomes furiously angry when she believes, likely immaturely, that her lover has cheated on her. Di che ella in tanta tristizia cade, e di quella in tanta ira, e per conseguente in tanto furor trascorse. This portrayal closely follows once again the Thomistic phenomenology of anger described by Loretta in the beginning, showing how a perceived offense leads to sorrow and then to a desire for revenge. Ninetta then indeed acts upon her rage by arranging for her lover's restagnone murder, no less. Accecata dalla sua ira, s'ha visto con la morte di Restagnone l'onta che riceverle era paruta vendicare. Now, the word onta used here and indicating the affront or sense of shame suffered by Ninetta and leading her to a furious anger was often employed by Dante in his accounts of anger within the Commedia. For example, the word is used in Inferno 29:33, the episode of Geri del Bello. The verb derived from this word, auntare, to take offense, was utilized by Dante in his account of the scene of ira in Purgatorio 17. And this is the lines, ed è chi per ingiuria parca onti, sì che si fa della vendetta ghiotto, e tal convien che il male altrui impronti. This evocation of Dante's terrace of anger was already apparent in the opening of Loretta's tale, when her description of the way anger plunges the mind's eye into blindness recalls the portrayal of the mist that blinds the wrathful in Dante's Terrace of Anger. By evoking Dante's account of sinful anger in the Commedia, Loretta underscores the excessive, indeed sinful nature of Ninetta's rage. And within the story, this rage ultimately plunges all those involved into a mayhem of death and betrayal, emerging, as in Seneca's tragedies, as the root of all the calamity. So in its ample demonstration of the perils of anger, the Cameron 4.3 aligns closely with the Stoic and patristic binary view of ira, one that is also implicit in the structure of the Purgatory of Dante. However, when we turn to story 1.9, which is, by the way, the shortest in the Decameron, a different picture emerges. Like 4.3, story 1.9 contrasts anger with mansuetude, yet it lingers on the danger of the opposite extreme, excessive mansuetude. The story, at the same time, revisits the question of female anger, while also bringing to the fore the political implications of princely anger or lack thereof. Narrated by Elisa, Story 1.9 tells of a noble Gascon woman who passed through the island of Cyprus on her way back from a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. While on the island, the lady was brutally assaulted da alcuni scellerati uomini. Grieving bitterly for the offense she suffered, senza alcuna consolazione dolendosi, the lady sought proper vendetta, asking it from the king of Cyprus. The description of the lady's response thus fits once again, and we know it by now, the scholastic definition, as an offense leads to sorrow and a desire for revenge, and I think it is significant that she wants this revenge from the sovereign. However, the inhabitants of the island dissuade the woman from her intentions, telling her that the king was of such weak disposition, rimessa vita, that he suffered without any response, not only offenses inflicted on his subject, but also on himself. Intanto che chiunque aveva cruccio alcuno, quello col fargli alcuna onta o vergogna sfogava. And note the onta appearing here again. So realizing now that she will not be able to obtain any justice from this king, the woman resolved to find at least an outlet for her anger and sorrow by insulting the king, thus imitating the actions of the other subjects. Let's read this passage, which is very important. La donna, disperata della vendetta, alcuna consolazione della sua noia, propose di voler mordere la miseria del detto re, e andatesene piangendo davanti a lui disse: Signor mio, io non venga nella tua presenza per vendetta, ch'io attenda della ingiuria che mi è stata fatta, ma in soddisfacimento di quella ti priego che tu mi insegni come tu soffri quelle le quali io intendo che ti sono fatte, a ciò che da te apparando io possa pazientemente la mia comportare. Now, as Pier Massimo Forni has argued, the Gascon woman emerges here as an artist of revenge, as she finds a sophisticated outlet for her sorrow and anger by a feigned tears and ironic witty speech, calling upon the king to teach her how to suffer insult so patiently. Her ironic retort, however, not only allows her to find some consolation for her anger and woes, but actually manages to transform the king, who grasps the irony in her words and abruptly changes his ways. As the narrator specified, it was as if the king suddenly awoke from a long slumber and finally secured justice by punishing harshly the wrongdoers, agramente vendico. And from that moment on, he became rigidissimo persecutore di ciascuno che contro l'onore della sua corona alcuna cosa commettesse. By ridiculing the incredible mansuetude of the king, this entire tale, I would like to argue, amounts to an ironic critique of a long Stoic and Christian tradition which exalted such princely patience. This tradition is encapsulated in the often used anecdote of the Athenian tyrant Pisistratus, which was first narrated by the Roman author Valerius Maximus in the first century Compendia of Moral Examples, Facta Edicta Memorabilia. In Book 5 of the work, Memorable Doings and Sayings, which deals with humanity and clemency as its theme, Valerius describes the benign way in which the tyrant responded to the affront of a suitor who kissed his daughter in public without her consent. While the tyrant's wife demanded that he execute the offender immediately, and note here the association of the woman with vindictive anger, he responded calmly with a wise retort, deflecting the prospect of violence. And the quotation goes like this: the wise saying of Pisistratus, "If we kill those who love us, what shall we do with those who hate us. Valerius praises Pisistratus for his humanitas and goes on to relate another incident in which the tyrant, like Boccaccio's King of Cyprus, bore with incredible patience the insults heaped upon him by an intoxicated courtier during dinner, remaining calm, completely calm, even when the courtier spat in his face. The anecdote of Pisistratos, as I'm sure you know, was utilized by Dante as the second of three exempla of virtuous mansuetude in the Terrace of Anger in Purgatorio 15. And there it is, Pisistratus is bookended by Maria and Saint Stephen. Dedicating no less than 4 terzine to the anecdote, Dante began with a sorrowful response of the tyrant's wife to the assault and her demand for vendetta. Vendicate di quelle braccia ardite che abbracciar nostra figlia, o Pisistrato. Dante then goes on to describe Pisistratus' benign response. Il Signor mi parea benigno e mite risponder lei con viso temperato. Che faremo noi a chi mai al ne desira, se quei che ci ama è per noi condannato? Just like Valerius, Dante does associate anger with the female figure and benevolent mansuetude with the benign tyrant, clearly urging his readers to follow upon his model of perfect mansuetude. Boccaccio will follow closely upon the Valerian and Dantean accounts in his early novel Philology, when he also utilizes the same anecdote and praises Pisistratus as a model of mansuetude. Ai Pisistrato, degno d'eterna memoria per la tua benignità, il quale udendo con pianti narrare la tua figliola essere baciata e di ciò dimandarti vendetta, non dubitarsi rispondere che faremo noi a nostri nemici se colui che ci ama è per noi tormentato. Tu in piccolo falò con grandissima temperanza mitigasti, conoscendo il movimento del falitore, dimorar possa tu con pietosa fama sempre nei cuori umani. It is wonderful, the prose of the Philology. Very nice rhythm. So in the Cameron 1:9, Boccaccio returns to this exemplum of princely mansuetude, yet now I think to present it in a negative light. While the king's incredible capacity to bear patiently assaults on both his subject and his honor evoke the exemplum of Pisistratus, here they are ostensibly ridiculed by the Gascon woman and the narrator alike. A sovereign, the story implies, in a manner that closely evokes Giles of Rome, must know how and when to be angry so as to preserve justice. He cannot remain aloof. It is no doubt significant, I think, that the story includes an account, as we have seen, of the negative view of the king's subjects of his mansuetude. The political danger the tale suggests inheres not in giving in to anger, but rather in not giving anger its due. The Gascon woman's ironic retort at the king, where she jokingly urges him to teach her patience, may thus be read as a parody of the entire Pisistratus tradition, showing the Stoic and Christian ideal as, in fact, a vice. And I won't get into it, but it's interesting that in one of Tasso dialogues, he actually combines together the example of Boccaccio's King of Cyprus and the Pisistratus anecdote. So, while offering a critique of the excessive mansuetude of the king, we should note the story 1:9 also validates, in clear opposition to 4:3, the anger of the female protagonist. Rather than portraying it as perilous or destructive, her anger and frustration are presented as natural and just, leading her to perform a sensible act of retribution against the inept ruler. By obtaining just vendetta through her witty words, the Gascon woman in fact comes to embody both Pisistratus' wife, the woman demanding vengeance, and Pisistratus himself, the one who manages to secure justice through wise use of words. The obvious difference is that in the Cameron 1:9, in opposition to Valerius and Dante, the woman is associated not only with vindictive anger, but also with wisdom. bringing the two together to serve the cause of justice. If the Cameron 4.3 offers an example of excessive anger, and the Cameron 1.9 critiques excessive mansuetude, then story 2.6, which again deals with both princely and female anger, offers a particularly rich example of virtuous anger and its specific attributes according to Boccaccio. And I would like to close our little journey with a discussion of the representation of anger in 2.6. The Cameron 2.6, which is narrated by Emilia, tells of Madame Beritola, a Sicilian noblewoman, whose two sons are kidnapped and sold into slavery. One of her sons arrives at the court of Corrado Malaspina in Lunigiana and serves there as a servant, hiding his identity due to political reasons. As usually happens in the Decameron, he falls in love with Corrado's daughter, and the two engage in a secret affair until they are accidentally discovered by her parents. The description of the parents' response to the sudden discovery gives ample attention to their anger, ira. The father, overwhelmed by the offense to his honor, throws them immediately into prison and plans to execute the two. Doloroso oltremodo questo vedendo, senza alcuna cosa dire del perché, amendui li fece pigliare a tre suoi servitori a un suo castello legati menarliene. Ed e ira e di cruccio, fremendo andava, disposto di farli vituperosamente morire. Here as well, the presentation of anger follows the scholastic phenomenology, as we have, again, anger as a response to injury to one's honor that leads to sadness and a desire for revenge. And I think it's striking how Boccaccio follows this scheme. At the same time, the account makes sure to highlight the excessive nature of Corrado's emotional outbursts, describing him as sorrowing oltremodo and the ira fremendo, thus recalling Ninetta in 4.3. While the father is thus foaming with anger and resolved on executing the two, the narrator moves to discuss the response of the mother. Focusing as well on her ira, the narrative, however, elaborates on how she managed to contain this anger and use it in a beneficial manner, thus giving her a crucial active role within the tale. Let's read this passage. La madre della giovane, quantunque molto turbata fosse e degna reputasse la figliola per lo suo falò de ogni crudel penitenza, avendo per alcuna parola di Corrado compreso qual fosse l'animo suo verso innocenti, non potendo ciò comportare, avvicinandosi sopraggiunse l'adirato marito e cominciolo a pregare che gli dovesse piacere di non correr furiosamente a volere nella sua vecchiezza della figliola divenir micidiale e a bruttarsi le mani dal sangue del suo fante, e che egli altra maniera trovasse a soddisfare all'ira sua, sì come di farli imprigionare e in prigione stentare e piangere il peccato commesso. While evidently disturbed by a daughter's behavior, the mother nonetheless manages to contain her anger and convince the father not to execute the lovers and thus inflict excessive revenge. Instead, she urges him to throw them into prison and give them the opportunity to undergo a process of repentance. The mother's anger in this respect is motivated not only by a perception of harm to her honor, as Aristotle would have it, but also, as Lactantius suggested, by the wish to correct the misguided behavior of her daughter and her lover, providing them with a space for due repentance, and this within a mundane secular context. This combination of Aristotle and Lactantius, of anger and charity, within a secularized context, thus becomes a defining feature of Boccaccio's conception of virtuous anger. to which he gives a powerful literary voice. At this point in the narrative, the narrator refers to the wife as a santa donna, a saintly woman, thus leaving little doubt that she in fact meant to embody an ideal type of anger. This validation of virtuous anger has not only ethical, but also important social and political dimensions. Corrado Malaspina, we should remember, is one of the noble princes Dante encounters in the Valley of the Princess in Purgatorio 8. He is the great-grandson of Frederick II, and thus a central figure within the Italian Ghibelline tradition and the old feudal guard in the peninsula. In Purgatorio 8, Dante presents him as an emblem of traditional virtues and cortesia. And in Decameron 2:6, as Christina Olsen also pointed out, he is mostly presented as a benign and courteous ruler. Yet this image is tainted by the episode of his furious anger engendered by the assault on his honor. Boccaccio's choice to emphasize this negative aspect in his behavior may thus be seen as a broader commentary on the problematic features inherent within feudal culture in his view, namely its excessive bent on individual honor and predilection for violent vendettas. Indeed, Corrado's excessive rage will be doubled by that of another feudal lord who loses his head in very similar circumstances, and of course Tancredi, the protagonist of 4-1, who upon discovering his daughter's Gismonda's secret affair, murders the daughter's lover and thereby precipitates a suicide. The difference between Corrado and Tancredi is precisely the presence of the former saintly wife, who dissuades Corrado of his intentions and shows the way for a more benign form of anger, one that is measured and that is concerned not only with personal honor, but also with the correction of faults. And as you know, in 4-1, there is no mother. There is Tancredi and Gismonda, and no mother is mentioned. Standing between the excessive anger of Ninetta in 4-3 and that of her own husband, and the extreme mansuetude of the king of Cyprus in 1-9, the Santa Donna of 2-6 emerges as an emblem of a righteous form of anger, one that not only brings together Aristotelian and Lactantian elements, vengeance and correction, but also offers a mean between feudal rage and stoic-like aloofness. Boccaccio's anger in this respect, I think, may be described as a new middle-class type of anger, one that is not only concerned with individual honor or other worldly aspiration, but also with the good of the civic community. And it is no doubt noteworthy that in both 1-9 and 2-6, this ideal type of anger is advanced by Boccaccio through a female protagonist, which is something that would be inconceivable for Aristotle or his heirs like Giles of Rome. Okay, so let me conclude by saying that the three stories we examined illustrate how the Decameron serves as a laboratory of anger, offering an elaborate and penetrating meditation on its phenomenological, ethical, political, and gendered dimensions. Oscillating between various forms of anger, Boccaccio ultimately utilizes storytelling and a philological dialogue with various philosophical and literary sources to advocate for a virtuous type of anger, ideally shaping his reader's emotional disposition. This notion of anger brings together Aristotelian concern with honor and patristic emphasis on anger as correction. In advocating for this middle path, Boccaccio calls into question both feudal vindictive tendencies and Stoic Christian idealization of complete mansuetude, epitomizing the exemplum of Pisistratos. This accommodation of anger, we might mention in closing, very briefly, leads Boccaccio to depart in important ways also from the nascent humanism of his friend and sometimes mentor Petrarch, who largely returned to the Stoic position and asserted that anger is essentially faulty. as the figure of reason, ratio, state in the De Remediis, in the Remedies for Fortune, a work written around the very same time as the Decameron, anger and vengeance should be avoided at all costs, no matter the circumstance. And Petrarch writes, nothing is more bitter than anger, and I do wonder why anyone would call it sweet. If you can find anything sweet in it, it is a savage sweetness unworthy of a man. For Petrarch, it is the benign Pisistratus who would undoubtedly serve as the ideal, whereas for Boccaccio, moderate anger is not only inevitable for humans, but essential to preserve a form of order and justice. With his nuanced literary approach to the ethics and politics of anger, Boccaccio's vernacular humanism offered a novel way to understand, represent, and ideally cultivate a benign form of anger in the later Middle Ages, introducing an approach to anger that I think is worthy of our consideration today, still today, exactly 650 years after Boccaccio's death. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gur. Can I have the microphone, please? Sorry, because my voice is a little. Okay. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk, and also let me fetch my notes here. I mean, thank you, because you really sort of showed us, I think, a very fascinating way of thinking about or rethinking about anger in ways which are not necessarily the most expected ones. And I particularly enjoy the argument which you're making about the possible way of thinking of a sort of a common, as a medium kind of ground, and also as a middle point. And it seems to me that there's something also, again, to go back to the roots, very Aristotelian about this way of dealing with the notion of anger. And I particularly like one of the final points which you made about a different kind of anger, something which is, as you said, middle class, which seems to imply also the possibility of using it as currency in relational interactions, not necessarily at the level of aristocracy or at the level of government, but also in everyday kind of interaction, which of course are, partly what Boccaccio is telling us about in the Decameron. So I think my initial sort of 2 points, which I would love to hear a little more about, and then of course we will open up to Q&As from the audience, are really, to what extent do you see your own argument about the golden mean in anger, in dealing with anger, as deep imbued with this Aristotelian notion of the golden mean, which of course applies to the way in which he deals with, Aristotle deals with the vices and virtues. And then the other point is, if you can say something more about how you see this middle class way of dealing with anger, and how it sort of fits in the broader picture of what Boccaccio is doing with describing the social life of the city he's talking about.
Okay, thank you. Very important points. I think Boccaccio is in many ways very Aristotelian, and I think that he draws a lot from Aristotle and Aquinas' ethics, and he moves around in the stories between when he discusses emotions, as I try to show, between the excess and the mean. And I think he tries to lead us to recognize the importance of the mean. Now, the thing is that we don't always, the characters in the Decameron not always manage to do that, right? It's always very difficult, and there's also a leftover, an element of excess there. But I think this is something that he directs us to in terms of where we should aspire. And I think that in the social interaction, as you say, I think what was important for me to show is that here is not only Aristotelian, because Aristotle is really about revenge. And this is a very classical notion, that anger is about revenge and vengeance. And there are some who, out of magnanimity, will choose not to take revenge, right? But not out of concern for the other. And I think this is where the Christian tradition comes in, the patristic tradition via Aquinas, which for it, anger is about interaction, is about relations, it's about correction. It's not about self, it's about other. And I think the way Boccaccio brings the two together, this is the unique aspect of what he does with anger in the Decameron. And this is what was important for me to show. I don't know if it was clear enough, but I think this is the crucial point. And this is where also the social element becomes very relevant. And I think this is, I think it is related to the civic culture. And I think there is something anti-feudal about that for Boccaccio, because the feudal tradition is also very much about honor, and he wants it to be not about honor, anger about correction, having it as a relational thing. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you. We do have a microphone over there, so yes.
Thanks so much, Gur. This was a really fabulous talk, and I look forward to hearing more about individual novellae. But I was just wondering, to what extent do you feel that the framing narrative for the Decameron, obviously the plague, and the extent to which, certainly in the 14th century, Boccaccio himself may not have adopted this, but the sense that God is angry at us, and so therefore we are being punished. To what extent do you see this narrative? It's not coming out of any of the scholastics per se, but it's certainly this idea of the, as you mentioned at one point very quickly in your talk, the angry God, right? A God who at this point is punishing us through the plague. Is there any resonance at all of this kind of interpretation, let's say, of this particular historical moment that you see in the novellae? Is Boccaccio's attempt to kind of redefine anger here, as you've so persuasively put it, especially through women, an interesting way of perhaps curtailing, let's say, an explanation for this horrific plague that is about our need to be sorry for what we've done to offend a very angry God? I'm just curious about how that larger, kind of framing aspect of the Decameron might, if at all, play in here.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. One way to respond to that would be, of course, to bring in Griselda and the closing story of the Decameron, because of course, we can read it as an allegory, as Petrarch did, about the God trying humanity, and humanity needs to accept everything, right? And if we take Griselda in this sense as a kind of exactly the example of meekness that accepts everything that happens, and with this certain of like a sort of Pisistratus. And I think that if I were to read another story, and obviously the closing story of the Decameron would be a way to conclude that, is to say that, look, Boccaccio closes the Decameron with an example of complete mansuetude, but then in the concluding remarks he overturns it and criticizes, who would act like that? Be angry, right? Here that there is a cause for anger. And so I think in this interaction with God, this where it might come in, and in this specific historical moment that, okay, humans have a right to be angry when such calamities happen, not excessively, but to an extent. So yeah, this would be one way to answer that. Yeah. But I need to think about it further, about the entire plague being a punishment of an angry God. Yeah.
Thank you, Gur. A lot to think about. Yeah, because then I started going through the Rolodex of the Decameron. All the people get angry, and then trying to fit them into your scheme of the three different
I'm ready to
types of anger. So Jane's point about the frame, I was thinking of that as well, especially since you invoked the first line about compassion, and that perhaps our compassion is not just feeling sorry for other people, but realize, right, is not getting angry also, right? I mean, the compassion is also that you think about other people, which is the wife, right? That's what she's doing in the Beritola story, right? She's thinking, well, let's calm our anger a bit because we should think about these other people and so forth as well. So the word that stuck out to me, because I know what else you've written, is the word for consolation.
Mm-hmm.
And that revenge is a kind of consolation. You know, I think about Rigoletto and oh joy, you know, just absolutely to find joy in revenge. And I wonder if you could have more to say about that, about what does consolation mean, you know, and it almost seemed kind of terrible there, you know, to be consoled might be to see the other person, you know, wounded or killed or damaged in a kind of, you know, tit for tat kind of justice that certainly Dante's Inferno is all about condemning, right? That there's this cycle of violence that you think you'll be consoled, but then it just leads to a cycle. Anyway, I just wondered if you had any thoughts about what consolation
Mm-hmm.
means as you're thinking about anger
Mm-hmm.
and justice and
Mhm.
compassion.
Yeah, no, that's a good thing to think about. My take on all that was that Boccaccio, also when he speak about compassion and when he speak about consolation, it is never meant to be something that is automatic, and it's never meant to be. He always wants us to think about these things, right? And in the opening sentence, umana cosa avere compassione, it sounds like as if, yes, this is a kind of compassion in any way, and when you actually turn into the stories, then you see that he always wants you to take a step back and reflect on the situation and think about the extent in which compassion is merited or unmerited. And this relates also to anger, because he wants us to be reflective and not just impulsive, both when it comes to anger and when it comes to compassion. Now, consolation as revenge is an interesting point, and it's not. I mean, I think if you think about the novella of the scholar and the widow, right? This is the obvious thing to consider in this regard. That like the Gascon woman, the scholar wants to find consolation in revenge, right? In avenging the widow. But there, it's all about, unlike in Dantean justice, not going too far, right? Knowing when to stop. This is always the test that Boccaccio wants us to think about. And so, yeah, you may find consolation in a sort of vengeance, but not excessive vengeance. Once you lose you lose yourself in revenge, then it's not consolation anymore, right? For Boccaccio, and the scholar shows it. Yeah, and yeah, I had something more to say, but thinking about that is obviously.
Can I ask a follow-up
Yeah.
question then? So is compassion an emotion
Oh yeah, of course.
and not a deliberate action that you're advised to? Yeah.
Not a deliberative action. Well, it's an emotion that supposed to lead to some kind of action, right? But it starts as an emotion which has a cognitive element. It's a movement that comes out of judgment. It has an element of judgment, and then it's supposed to lead to action that alleviates distress. And I think that this is where it also relates to anger. This is where Boccaccio, this is the relational element that emotions have for Boccaccio. And we see it in compassion, and we see it in anger from different directions. Yeah.
Which is so relevant to the question of relational things, right? Because I think what is fascinating about the very final point you just made, Gur, is that anger about what's happening to someone else, for instance, has to do a lot with compassion, right? I mean, in a way, what is interesting about the audience in the Decameron is that we are, of course, invited to be compassionate and to sort of feel together with what's happening in the story, both at the level of the frame, but of course also at the level of the novelle themselves. But then there are some stories, and of course Griselda comes to mind, but one could come up with other examples where the audience, if they are compassionevoli, they are inevitably feeling anger for what's happening, especially with cases of injustice or cases of mistreatment. And so I see there in this notion of relational interaction another area where anger and compassio and compassion are kind of similar. And the burden of anger is not just about the characters involved in the stories, but also in the response on the part of the audience, isn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think there's something about this double nature of this particular emotion, which has to do both with the subject matter of the novelle, but also with our response as readers, and in general the audience's response.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I agree. There is another layer here to unpack. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, Scott.
So, thinking about how you had described some points about Boccaccio's sense of anger in contrast to Dante, it sort of got me thinking about the question of anger in Dante, which, of course, is treated in a number of ways. But I'm curious if, in thinking about Boccaccio's anger as, let's just say, tempered in this way, do you see Dantean anger as always more extreme? Is the departure there that there is some kind of modification in Boccaccio that doesn't take place regarding anger in Dante, or is there something else? Let's say.
No, that's a great question. I mean, anger in Dante is so complex because he's so angry as a character all the time. And then he gives you these examples of mansuetude, and you need to be calm, and he's so angry. So it's very complex, and that's why I focus specifically on the terrors of anger in the Purgatorio, because I think this is, okay, Dante tries to give us the examples of mansuetude, and I think that it's here where Boccaccio tries to modify him and say, this ideal of mansuetude that you give us is not realistic, and we need to move away from it. It can't work, and it won't work in the worldly context. And I think here perhaps Boccaccio is adopting something of the Dante persona rather than Dante autore, a poeta, I think, in this sense. So on top of my head, that would be an answer to that. Yeah.
I mean, we do have time for one more question if someone wants to sort of take the privilege of the last question. Otherwise, I think we should thank Professor Zak again.
Thank you very much for listening.
And for the discussion.